this day we remember St. Anthony, the great father of monks. On this day we remember a man who did something extremely revolutionary when he left behind a family life that was comfortable, and he went into the desert. He walked out of society. He walked out of everything that was familiar, everything that was safe, in order to begin a new model of spiritual existence. And one that we have had glimpses of before in the Old Testament. If we think of the great prophet Elijah, when in the wilderness he encountered God and he sought God. We have the example, of course, of St. John the Baptist out in the desert, preparing the way of the Lord. And yet this was different. We heard not so many weeks ago how society flocked to the desert, to the barren places, in order to hear St. John, to hear his message as he prepared for the coming of the Christ. In St. John, the wilderness becomes a busy place, full of preaching, full of conversation, full of people asking questions. For St. Anthony, it was so different. Because St. Anthony was retreating from the world in order to seek God. St. Anthony was retreating from the world, and yes, he retreated into the desert. And if you cast your mind back to the story of St. Anthony, he went to different places. That he went and lived in a tomb. He went and lived in an abandoned fort. And of course we remember the cave on Mount Colzim, where St. Anthony also struggled in prayer. This was so different to John, because the lesson for us from St. Anthony is that of having nothing between us and God. It's us, it's God. There's other things there. If we look at stories and legends and paintings of the temptations of St. Anthony, we know that there was a lot else, that the demons assailed St. Anthony and that they attacked him in this new model of life that he established, and he became the father of monks. Earlier, the church had faced martyrdom, and for people like St. Anthony, once the church settled down, they thought that Christian life had become too easy, that they'd become too comfortable, even too complacent in the Christian life. There was no longer a challenge. There was no longer a cost to being a Christian. It was too easy. And so Anthony looked for another way of martyrdom. If we look at the saints of Ireland and of Scotland, they spoke of the monastic life as a form of martyrdom. Indeed, they spoke of the different colours of martyrdom, one of them being exile. St. Anthony certainly took on this. The martyrdom of exile, the martyrdom of leaving behind everything that was safe and everything that was familiar. What did people think of this man? They must have thought that he was absolutely raving mad. St. Anthony wasn't a pauper. His family was a family that was comfortable. His existence was one that never left him hungry, that never saw him go without. For most people surrounding him in rural Egypt, the life that he and his family led was one perhaps of which other people were jealous. They'd have liked this certainty, they'd have liked this security. They'd have liked to know that there would always be food on the table and that there would always be everything that was needed. And yet St. Anthony walked away from all of this. And people must have shaken their heads and said, what is he doing? He wasn't an old man, this was a young man. Of course, we had a man of a similar age who came to Jesus, and he was told to sell everything that he had, to give the money to the poor, and to up sticks, to leave it all behind and follow Christ. And of course, despite being righteous and godly, this young man could not do it. St. Anthony certainly does it here, and he goes out into the wilds. He didn't care what anybody thought of him. He didn't care what his own family thought of him. He didn't care what his elders thought of him. He was singular in the vision of what he had to do. He had to reject comfort and security in order to seek the face of Christ. We had, of course, in the second gospel, the rather simpler Beatitudes, blageni, than the ones that we hear, which very much speak of poverty, but of course end in virtually the same way as the usual Beatitudes that we have. Blessed are you when men shall hate you, when they shall separate you from their company, and shall reproach you and cast out your name of evil for the Son of Man's sake. Rejoice in that day, and leap for joy, for behold, your reward is great in heaven. What are the Beatitudes telling us? They're telling us that if we are doing things for the sake of faith and for the sake of Christ, who cares what anybody else thinks about us? Who cares? This is just one lesson that I want to take from St. Anthony for all of us. We can take, of course, 100 others. This lesson of who cares. We live in a world in which we are sometimes paralyzed by what other people think. We could talk about the tyranny of other people's opinions. We live in a world which goes on follows, friends, and likes. And we're terrified sometimes what other people think about us. People who are stuck to Facebook because they have to see if the statistics that surround them have improved. They have to look. Companies have analysts who have got to be looking all day long to see what other people think. Of course, sometimes it's to our advantage to go onto Twitter and to say how disgusting it is in whatever branch of Costa, and then remarkably see that within half an hour there's been a phone call and everybody's run out and the place is suddenly immaculate. But we go beyond this. We are obsessed as human beings in the opinions of others. Think back to when you were young and you were at school. We grow up from the youngest age worrying about what other people think. We need to have the right clothes, we need to have the right trainers, we need to have the right accessories because of what other people may think of us. What does this lead to? It means that instead of being the people that we really are, we build a disguise, we build a persona around us. And this can happen spiritually as well as in other aspects of life. How do we live our lives? Are we willing to do things for the sake of Christ and for the sake of faith that will have others look at us, laugh at us, mock us, talk about us, tweet about us? It's a big ask for us to say, we have to get on with it. We have to not care about these things. We're human beings. We bruise, we bleed, we're offended, we harbour things, we think about things. And yet, this challenge of the Beatitudes is the challenge that Anthony faced when he went into the world, out of the world. To go out of the world and to do what was needed, saying, forget everybody else. The only approval that I need in life is from God. I don't need Facebook likes or Twitter likes. I don't need followers. I don't need people patting me on the head and saying, oh, well done. We can see that society is turning more and more against faith. At the same time that individuals in society are actually looking more and more for faith. What a paradox. But we do have to follow the example of this figure going out into the desert. And we need to start living for Christ. Living for Christ in us. Christ should be living in us. Our life should be Christ. Our actions should be Christ's. Our words should be Christ's. Not surprisingly, when we turn to the Lord himself, he didn't go around looking for likes and for retweets and for followers. He went, and sometimes we see that miracles were performed, and he actually told the people, keep it quiet. Sometimes he quietly slipped away because he didn't want anybody to even know that he was the one that had performed the miracle. He didn't need the likes. He didn't need the approval. If this is true of Christ, what about us? So, we head towards Post, we head towards Lent. And very soon we'll be entering into the pre-Lenten reading, starting with that Gospel of Zacchaeus. And what do we see there? We see a man about whom everybody had an opinion, a negative one. We saw a man who was an outcast, a man who most certainly was not liked. And he turned to Christ, and he found all of the approval that he needed. He didn't need anything else. The church, not just us, the church does not need the stamp and the approval of everybody else. We don't need to reinvent ourselves. We don't need to be modern. We don't need to be hip. We know whenever the word hip is used, it's in a pretty miserable, horrible way in which those religious bodies doing it do not know young people or do not know the world. We need to be steadfast. We need to be solid. And we need to be Christ-focused. We don't need to be progressive. We don't need to be popular. We don't need to be liked. We simply need to be true. When St. Anthony went into the desert, he sought the truth of God. He sought to become face to face with Christ, who said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And he did it despite everybody else, turning away from their opinions, focused only on Christ. In the week ahead, when you feel a bit wounded by perhaps something that somebody else has said about you, when you've heard gossip, when you've heard negativity, think of St. Anthony, think of Christ, and live only for him. When you go onto the computer, when you log into Facebook, or any social media you may use, don't go looking for likes. Don't worry. We only need the approval of Christ. That's the only stamp, that's the only like that we need. Follow St. Anthony and withdraw from all of this clutter that nobody needs to get to the kingdom of heaven. Amen.